the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet.
By this time, I had grown used to Holmes's eccentric ways and his strange mix of knowledge, though I still could not quite place the man. He baffled me with his brilliance one moment, and then seemed shockingly ignorant in another. Yet it was only when word reached him of a murder in Brixton Road that I began to understand what his true calling was. That morning marked my first experience of Holmes at work in the field, and it opened my eyes to the extraordinary nature of his craft. The case came to be known as the Lauriston Garden Mystery. It was still early when Holmes and I set out for the scene of the crime. A thick yellow fog clung to the streets, muffling the sounds of carts and horses, while the lamps still burned dully through the haze. Holmes strode quickly at my side, full of energy, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, as though this grim errand were to him an invigorating exercise. "Isn't it splendid, Watson?" he said suddenly, swinging his cane as we turned a corner. "A real case, with every promise of complexity. I've been longing for this. You'll see, today is a fine opportunity to test the science of deduction." His enthusiasm seemed almost unsettling, considering we were about to view the scene of a violent death. Yet I could not help but be drawn into his excitement. I was curious to see how his strange talents would apply in practice. We soon reached Brixton Road, where a policeman directed us to the side street of Lauriston Gardens. There, standing before one of a row of empty, half-built houses, was a small knot of onlookers, kept at bay by constables. A high wooden fence enclosed the garden, but the gate stood open. Holmes greeted Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard with a warmth that suggested old acquaintance. Gregson was a fair-haired man with a quick manner, always eager to impress. Beside him stood Inspector Lestrade, shorter, leaner, sharp-eyed, with a dark expression that hinted at suspicion even before any facts were presented. Between the two of them, I later learned, lay a rivalry as fierce as any in the yard. "We've kept everything exactly as it was," Gregson announced, almost proudly. "Nothing has been touched." Holmes inclined his head. "Very wise. Lead the way." We stepped inside the house. The air struck me immediately. It was close, heavy, and faintly metallic, as though tainted with blood, though none was visible at first glance. The hall was bare, the plaster walls unfinished, dust hanging in the air. A few steps brought us into the front room where the tragedy had occurred. I confess, the sight before me was shocking. On the floor, sprawled on his back with arms outstretched, lay the body of a man of middle age, well dressed in a dark coat and trousers, but without hat. His face was horribly contorted, the eyes staring wide open, and his lips drawn back in a rictus of terror. It was not the calm of heart failure. That is terror, Watson, sheer terror. Beside him on the floor, smeared in blood, were letters scrawled in a bold hand, R-A-C-H-E. "Rucker," muttered Gregson. "That's German for revenge, is it not? What do you make of that, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes bent over, studying the word with his magnifying lens. "It may mean revenge, or it may mean nothing, but let us not jump to conclusions. The important thing is to note what the letters can tell us about the writer." He moved swiftly around the room, examining every corner with restless attention, the plaster, the dust on the floor, the ashes in the fireplace, the window sills. He paused frequently to kneel, sometimes even lying flat to bring his face close to the ground. At one point he took out a tape measure, carefully noting distances. Lestrade gave a little snort of impatience. "He's at it again with his magnifying glass. You don't really expect to learn anything from that, do you?" Holmes smiled faintly, but said nothing. He continued his work as precise as a surgeon. I myself tried to study the body. The man appeared well-fed, of strong build. His hands, though clenched, bore no sign of struggle. His clothes were unruffled, except that the buttons of his coat had been undone. There was not a drop of blood upon him, save where it had been smeared to write the word on the wall. "Cause of death?" I murmured to Holmes. He shook his head. "No wound, no stab, no bullet, something internal. We'll have to wait for the post-mortem. But you see the face. That is not the calm of heart failure. That is terror, Watson. Sheer terror." Gregson pointed to the letters again. "It's plain enough. Some German fellow did this, wrote revenge and fled." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "You really think so? Then why write it in German, in a lonely house in London? And why stop after the first 5 letters? No, no, this was meant to mislead. A clever ruse, but an obvious one." He then examined the floor by the window, where I saw nothing but dust. But he pointed with satisfaction. "There has been a woman here, Watson. Look, the impression of a small foot, fine leather, pointed toe, a lady's shoe, not more than size 6. Gregson and Lestrade bent down in disbelief. "How can you tell it's a woman?" Lestrade asked skeptically. Holmes tacked the print with his finger. The arch, the delicacy of the heel, the narrowing of the sole. No man's boot makes that mark. And here, see, another impression by the fireplace. Yes, a woman has been in this room. Whether she is witness, accomplice, or victim, we must yet determine." He went on, almost playfully, pointing out details none of us had noticed. Cigar ash of a particular kind, showing the killer smoked trichinopoly, splashes on the wall that revealed the body had been moved after death, and a scratch on the floorboards where furniture had been dragged. As for the dead man's pockets, they contained no purse, no watch, and no papers except for a simple wedding ring, which Holmes examined intently. "What do you make of it?" asked Gregson. Holmes rose, dusting his knees. "That someone wished to conceal the identity of this man, but failed entirely. His appearance, his age, his dress, his ring. Within 24 hours I shall know his name. Mark my words." The inspectors exchanged doubtful glances, but Holmes only chuckled softly. Finally, we left the house, stepping into the damp air of the garden. Holmes paused, crouched, and examined the path. "Footprints," he said. "Several men, but one in particular, broad, square-toed boots. Heavy man, about 6 feet tall judging from the stride. He was here." I marveled at how he drew such conclusions from what to me was nothing but broken earth. As we turned away, Lestrade muttered, "He's always so confident, but let's see if he can actually prove anything." Holmes leaned toward me as we walked. "Did you notice, Watson? Not a trace of food or drink in the house. They met there for secrecy, not for comfort. This is not a case of robbery, nor simple murder. Something deeper, more deliberate, and I mean to find it." His eyes shone with excitement. "The game is afoot." And with that phrase, which I would hear many times in our adventures, we left Lauriston Gardens, carrying with us the first threads of a mystery that promised to entangle us in a most singular crime.
When Sherlock Holmes announced his intention of making a visit to the scene of the murder, I naturally offered to accompany him. It was still early in the day, and London lay beneath a sky of sullen grey, the morning mist rising sluggishly from the Thames and curling among the narrow streets of Brixton. The air carried with it the dampness of the night before, and the hansom cab we engaged rattled noisily over the cobbled roads as we set off toward the district where the strange crime had occurred. Holmes sat opposite me, his long, lean figure stretched out carelessly, yet his keen eyes never ceased to dart from window to window, noting the smallest occurrences on the street. Every passer-by, every wagon laden with goods, every sign of human activity seemed to attract his scrutiny. I, who knew nothing yet of the methods of his peculiar science, could only marvel at his restless observation. "You see, Watson," he said suddenly, tapping the floor of the cab with the ferrule of his cane, "crimes such as these are often solved not by grand leaps of imagination, but by the accumulation of trifles that the ordinary observer passes without remark. If I had to give you one maxim of my art, it would be that the smallest detail may be the one link which completes the chain." I nodded, though truthfully I did not yet grasp the full import of his words. The cab rolled on until at last we turned into a rather dreary, half-built suburb. Long rows of brick houses stood on either side, many unfinished, their bare skeletons of wood and brick rising bleakly against the sky. Piles of builders' rubbish littered the road, and scattered workmen moved idly about their business. It was a dismal, cheerless place, and one felt at once why the crime had made such a stir in the neighborhood. Murder in such an unfinished, desolate quarter seemed doubly strange. At length the cab drew up before a modest two-storied house, its windows shuttered and a constable on guard at the door. Holmes sprang lightly out, and I followed. We were admitted after a word from Holmes, who produced his card with an air of quiet authority that impressed even the stolid policeman. Inside the air was close and faintly oppressive. The hallway was narrow, and the boards creaked beneath our feet as we were shown into the sitting room where the body had been discovered the previous night. It was a bare, unfurnished chamber, with cracked plaster on the walls and a dusty wooden floor. In one corner stood a plain deal table. Opposite, a fireplace choked with builder's refuse. The sunlight, struggling through a grimy window, fell coldly upon a dark stain on the floorboards, the very spot where Enoch J. Drebber had met his untimely end. Though the body had been removed, the place still bore the imprint of horror. Holmes stood silent for several minutes, his head bent, his eyes roving over every inch of the floor and walls. He walked noiselessly about the room, sometimes halting abruptly, sometimes dropping on one knee to examine some minute speck or scrap. His magnifying lens flashed in the grey light as he bent over a corner of the boards, and I could hear him muttering softly to himself. I confess that I, watching him, felt a certain awe. His whole soul seemed absorbed in his work, his face pale and eager, his movements quick and certain, like a hound upon a scent. After a time he straightened up, his eyes sparkling with a light of satisfaction. "Remarkable," he exclaimed softly, "most remarkable." He glanced toward me and smiled faintly. "We have already learned more than the police dream of, my dear Watson. Observe. What would you deduce from that footmark there by the window?" I looked where he pointed. A dull impression, half lost in the dust, showed upon the floor. I said, "It appears to be a man's foot." "Precisely. But note the length of the stride, the depth of the heel, and the peculiar square-toed boot. We have a tall man, strongly built, and evidently accustomed to wearing American-made boots. Combine this with the ring found clenched in the dead man's hand, and the trail becomes clearer. But let us not get ahead of ourselves." At this moment there was a step outside, and the door opened to admit a stout, red-faced man in police uniform. It was Inspector Gregson, whom I recognized by reputation as one of the Scotland Yard detectives of some credit. With him came his colleague, the quick ferret-like Lestrade. Both bowed stiffly to Holmes, though with a shade of condescension, as if his presence were more tolerated than welcomed. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Inspector Gregson, "you are here early on the ground. Have you found anything of interest?" "A little," replied Holmes carelessly. "But tell me first, where is the constable who discovered the body?" "Rance. He is at the station, making his report." "Then we must see him at once. He is the one man who can give us the first-hand account of how the house appeared at the moment of discovery. Watson, will you come?" We departed, leaving the detectives to pursue their own inquiries. The walk to the police station took us through the long, monotonous streets of Brixton, the houses all of one pattern, small gardens in front, and a general air of depressing uniformity. The grey sky hung low, and a chill wind blew fitfully down the road, yet Holmes strode on briskly, his mind evidently occupied with some internal calculation, for he barely exchanged a word until we reached the little red brick station. Inside, a group of constables lounged about, pipes in hand, talking over the events of the night. At Holmes' request, they summoned John Rance, the man who had been on duty. He proved to be a rough, square-shouldered fellow with a good-humoured face and a manner of easy confidence. His uniform was a little shabby, and his hands bore the marks of a working man. He touched his helmet respectfully when he saw us. "You were on duty near the house in Lauriston Gardens last night?" Holmes began. "Yes, sir, that I was," Rance replied. "It was about 2 in the morning when I noticed a light in the empty house. Thought it queer, I did, seeing as how it had been vacant for some time. So I goes over and looks in, and what should I find but the door standing ajar? I stepped inside, and there was the poor gentleman lying dead upon the floor." "Describe everything exactly as you saw it," Holmes said, leaning forward intently. Rance scratched his head. "Well, sir, the room was as bare as my hand. There was the body in the middle, and blood about, though not much considering. No signs of a struggle that I could see. But the queerest thing of all was the word written on the wall, Rachie, in letters of blood. I started at this, for the newspapers had not mentioned it in detail. Holmes only nodded as though he had expected it. "And did you see anyone leaving the house?" he asked quickly. Rance shook his head. "Not a soul, sir. But I did hear a quick step in the road just as I went in. Might have been imagination, of course, but it seemed to me like someone running away." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And you made no attempt to pursue?" "Well, sir, my duty was with the body. Couldn't leave it, could I? Besides, I had no notion what had happened until I struck a light and saw the man dead." Holmes gave a little impatient shrug, but said nothing. He asked a few more questions, drawing out every small point of detail: the state of the door, the position of the furniture, even the weather at the time. Rance, though somewhat bewildered by the minuteness of the inquiries, answered readily enough. At last Holmes rose. "Thank you, Constable. You have been of service. That will do." When we had left the station, Holmes broke into a low laugh. "What do you think of it all, Watson?" "I hardly know," I admitted. "It seems to me dark enough. A word on the wall. What can that mean?" "It means revenge," Holmes replied gravely, "written in German. But mark me, Watson, it was no German who wrote it. That is the trick of it. Our criminal is clever, devilishly clever, but he has overreached himself in that one point. There is much yet to unravel, but I fancy we have already gained a clearer view than either Gregson or Lestrade." As he spoke, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a fleeting brightness upon the dreary suburb. It was as though the very light of day seemed to promise that the darkness of the mystery would soon be dispelled by the keen reason of my extraordinary companion.